that I'm sure that all of us lived through the period of accusations against the Rosenbergs as atomic spies. And if you're like me at that time, you just assumed, well, they must be innocent because the government is framing them. Lots of things have changed since then, and we'll talk about that a bit. And just to see some of the stuff that is still being revealed about what was going on in the 1940s and 50s. It's very strange. Some people often ask me about books, and here are three that are pretty interesting. The Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. If you have time to read an 1,100-page book, it's pretty interesting, but there's a lot of detail in there about J. Robert Oppenheimer, and I'll say something about stuff from the book. That was done about, I've forgotten, 10 or 15 years ago. Frank Close's Trinity, The Treachery and Pursuit of the Most Dangerous Spy in History. That came out about a year ago about Klaus Fuchs, and we'll talk about him. And then Peter Wright, Spycatcher, 1987, still has some interesting revelations. And I don't think we have that here in our library. If they accept used books, I'll give them mine, but we'll see. In 1938, there was developed what at that time was called the atomic pile, and we now call it a nuclear reactor. And as just copied this from Wikipedia, a device used to initiate and control a fission, nuclear chain reaction or nuclear fission reactions. And it runs through steam turbines. The people who worked on this were a lot of scientists at the University of Chicago. It's interesting that Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard took out a patent on it. Their idea was that that it was for the public. They did not want it to go private. Are people having, can people hear me? If not, tell me if there's a problem. Well, just started. Okay, no complaints. So here's the atomic pile with Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, 1938. They realized, this was the 20s and 30s were really a time of great advances in physics. Here's a picture of the first nuclear reactor. Not that I can tell anything other than it looks like something they're building, but this is the picture we get of it. They then, in 1939, there were people, Leo Szilard in particular, one of the two people that I just mentioned, were worried about an atomic bomb. And Szilard in particular, convinced Albert Einstein to write a letter to President Roosevelt. And here's it says in the letter: in the course of the last 4 months, it has been made probable, and then he cites this work, that it may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium by which vast amounts of power and large amounts of new radium-like elements will be generated. Now it appears almost certain that this could be achieved in the immediate future. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and this is what people had trouble grasping. And it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type carried by boat and exploded in a port, they thought that that's the time these things were too heavy to be carried by airplane, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. However, such bombs might very well prove to be too heavy for transportation by air. Now, Einstein takes this letter, which Szilard helped him write. I understand that Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines, which she has taken over. That she should have taken such early action might perhaps be understood on the ground that the son of the German Undersecretary of State von Weizsäcker is attached to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, where some of the American work on uranium is now being repeated. And he goes on to say the Germans might be developing a bomb. That's really what they were scared about. And it happened all through the war. They were worried that the Germans would develop the atomic bomb and the Allies would be at the mercy of the Germans. So Roosevelt did not respond immediately. Whoops. And I don't know if you can see that on my screen. I'm having some issues on my screen, but let me see. They formed an advisory committee on uranium, but there was no full-scale effort of any sort until 1942. And then the government got scared. They set up a committee. What are we going to do about this atomic power? And Los Alamos, which you presumably have heard of, becomes the center of research for the American atomic work, 1942 to 45. There are other places, the University of Chicago has this atomic pile. There's a Manhattan project that's worked on in New York. There's some work initially at the University of California, but Los Alamos, out in the New Mexico desert, completely isolated, becomes the center for American research. And to some people's surprise, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who at that time was a professor of physics at the University of California, is named head of the project. And it was really quite a concentration of scientists. So if you look at the names of the people that are there, we have a whole bunch of Nobel Prize winners who were working there, or scientists who became quite famous. I'll say a little bit more about Oppenheimer's past in a minute. But he is one of the things that gets quoted. Trinity at that time, that's the test explosion of the first atomic bomb, 1945. And he's quoted as saying, I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another. And this, I give you this quote, this is held against him. I mean, it becomes quite a thing in the McCarthy period. He met with, actually with President Truman. Truman did not like Oppenheimer. He found him to be wishy-washy. And Truman is supposed to have asked Oppenheimer, you know when the Russians are going to have a bomb? Never. That was Truman's notion. His, like a lot of, from what we read about Truman, like a lot of insecure people, he becomes very strong in his opinions. And although he did some really good things as a president, he really was very obstinate and did not always listen too well. Remember that while Truman is president, Senator McCarthy becomes the face of the Red Scare in America. Although McCarthy wasn't the only one, we had the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which sees spies everywhere. McCarthy becomes the face of what's going on. At the same time, the Soviets are working on an atomic bomb. We don't, the Americans sort of blotted this out. They didn't want to accept that Russia could actually have scientists. And it's interesting that that program was directed by Laurenti Beria, who becomes infamous later as the head of the Soviet secret police, a very frightening person. But the story is that you read, and what he said is that the Soviets did develop their own bomb, and what he used, the material that comes from the spies, and we'll see that in a minute, just to check what they were doing and help them point their way. Whatever happened there, they exploded an atomic bomb in 1949, which was a shocker to a lot of people in the United States, and it gave impetus to the Red Scare, to McCarthy, the House Un-American Activities Committee. After all, how could those dumb Russians do anything? They must have stolen it. This is really the notion, that the Russians are incapable of any scientific advance. I must say the Russians have shown a lot of expertise in spying then and now. When you think of, the cyber warfare that they're good at, the poisonings abroad that we've read about. So they have their own traditions of things that they're experts in. This is a picture of what was seen as the subatomic bomb. Until I saw this, I never knew exactly what an atomic bomb looked like. Not that I understand the physics of it, but there it is. Well, when we get to the spies, there were probably, as far as we can tell, 4 spies at Los Alamos itself. The most important scientist among them is this man in the upper left named Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs had come from England. England's scientists were sent to the United States to work on this bomb because they didn't have the facilities, they didn't have the resources, and it was felt that we should combine, the Americans and the British should combine their expertise. They did have some good scientists. Now, Fuchs was no different from other German refugees. He had left Germany in the early 1930s to come to do graduate work and then to do research in Great Britain. The only evidence they had, the British had a report that Fuchs had been a member of the Communist Party. But this report came from the Gestapo. So the British discounted it, although it was probably true that he had been a member of the Communist Party. And he is considered a brilliant theoretical physicist. He was not a lead person at Los Alamos, but he did a lot of work at Los Alamos. Later on, he worked with Edward Teller in creating the hydrogen bomb. And somewhere in the late 30s, he volunteers to send information to the Soviet Union. He has contacts in Britain. Later on, they reconstructed who these contacts were. And when he was confronted with his spying in 49, he did confess. Interestingly enough, there was some guilt involved because they only confronted him with some little bit of evidence, and then he confessed to this entire scheme of sending stuff to the Soviet Union, important stuff that he had sent. There was also, the bottom left here, David Greenglass, who's the brother of Ethel Rosenberg. He was not a high-ranking scientist, but he had access to materials, and he apparently funneled stuff to his brother-in-law, who was Julius Rosenberg. He's a courier. He sends stuff. We have a picture there of Ted Hall, who looks like he's a teenager. He may well have been. Apparently he graduated high school at 14, graduated Harvard at age 18. also may have been the youngest person at Los Alamos. Also a very accomplished scholar. He later on moved to Great Britain and became very well known for his biological research. But he was there at Los Alamos. We, going back to Fuchs, Fuchs's testimony led to Harry Gold, who was another spy, not at Los Alamos. Greenglass implicated Rosenberg, and he got a lesser sentence, presumably because he was trying to get immunity for his wife. And the Rosenbergs were convicted mainly on the basis of what he said. Ted Hall reached out to the Soviets in 1944. He gave them updates on the plutonium bomb, that is the H bomb. He was suspected by the FBI in the early 1950s. He never confessed to anything, and the FBI did not want to reveal its sources, which we'll talk about in just a minute. How do we know all this stuff? Anyway, Hall went to Britain, worked in biological research. And then we have this Oscar Seebohrer, who, well, he died in 2015, but we didn't even know until 2019 that he had been among these spies. All this stuff comes from what are called the Venona transcripts, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But here you have the major US research project of applied research, building an atomic bomb, and there are at least 4 people who have been shown to have been spies there for the Soviets, sending material to the Soviet Union. And we'll say again, it doesn't seem to have been for monetary reasons. Later on, spies in the later part of the 20th century, a lot of times they're paid off, but these are apparently ideological. They see that, they feel that the Soviet Union is the light of the future. Ted Hall is quoted later on, he said he did not want to see an American monopoly of atomic weapons. Very hard to know what people's motivations are, but it just seems so clear that it's ideology which is pushing them along and not monetary gain. So how do we know what was going on? That's really an issue. We have what are called the Venona transcripts. These are some of the books that have come out about it. What happened is in the 1930s, intelligence services adopted the one-time code pad. That is, when you send messages, they can be interpreted on the basis of a pad, and then you throw away the page. It's considered unbreakable that you would have something like this. However, in 1945, there was an American cryptanalyst who discovered, or a soldier discovered, a partially burned notebook in Finland. And what they found was the Russians were running short of such pads, and they reused one. In the 1940s, the Americans and the British cryptanalysts, and the British were in the lead in this deciphering stuff, worked on the Venona files. It was a very tedious project. It wasn't as though, oh, here's the answer to everything. They just had to work on what, it's equivalent to deciphering hieroglyphics. You really have to work with, they're using numbers here. And I've read explanations. It was still confusing to me that there's a 4-number code that you add it to the numbers that you find in the message, and somehow you develop a message. And they had some very sharp cryptanalysts working on this stuff that all through the late 40s and early 50s. The trouble of this is that there are many names in there. Some of them are spies, and some are just names that are targets. And I haven't read this anywhere, but my feeling is that someone was giving those names to Senator McCarthy. He got up in the Senate. I have the names of whatever it is, 350 spies in the State Department. Well, they're names. We don't know exactly what those names meant. There were all kinds of talk about recruiting people on the basis of supposed left-wing sympathies. Doesn't make them a spy. But at any rate, by the late 1940s, there was enough progress made in deciphering that they could find that there were indeed spies. But they found out there were 14 Russian agents in the OSS. OSS is the agency that eventually became the CIA. We suspect that there were 5 agents who had access to the White House, and there were several, and we just looked at the 4 who were inside the American Atomic Weapons Program. There were 4 at Los Alamos, and there were others elsewhere. Julius Rosenberg being someone elsewhere. Venona itself was kept secret. The FBI knew about it. The British knew about it. They did not want to reveal it because they wanted to keep working on it. And this became one of the problems that they had, because it wasn't definite proof. They had to find more proof. And I must say that the British, for all the bumbling of their secret services, and when you read about it, they were a bunch of bumblers. They found it important to stick to the law. That is, when they found out that Klaus Fuchs was a spy, for example, they needed to get evidence that would stand up in court. I should say, by the way, that Fuchs was, well, we'll see it again in a minute. He was sentenced to jail. I mean, the Rosenbergs are the only ones who are ever executed in all this stuff. The Venona project was shut down in 1954. It was secret. And it's possible that Kim Philby, who is, you may know the name, the master spy in Great Britain, was effective in shutting down the study and deflecting what was going on. But then in 1959, there were some Swedish intercepts of Russian radio traffic, which revived the interest in the Venona material. Now, the most, at least for me growing up, and I suspect that for a lot of you, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg that was the most famous case of the time. You recall they were sentenced to death. There was an international campaign not to pardon, well, some to pardon them, but also to overturn the death sentence. You do have this judge, Irving Kaufman. Here's what he says to them when he sentenced them to death. I consider your crime worse than murder. Plain, deliberate, contemplated murder is dwarfed in magnitude by comparison with the crime you've committed. In committing the act of murder, the criminal kills only his victim. The immediate family is brought to grief, and when justice is meted out, the chapter is closed. But in your case, I believe your contact is putting into the hands of the Russians The A-bomb, years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, has already caused, and this has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. That's a lot to put on one or two people. And, you know, the fact that Kaufman, a supposedly impartial judge, would meet at night with Roy Cohn, who is one of the most sinister lawyers of our time, to try to tell him what to do. He got secret reports from the FBI. I mean, the trial in many ways was a farce. We also think that it's questionable that Ethel Rosenberg was involved in the passing of secrets. Julius Rosenberg was an engineer and he did pass some secrets on some stuff. We think that the charges were made against Ethel in order to get him to confess, which he refused to do. And, you know, you have Kaufman, a real bloodthirsty judge who sentenced them both to death. Here's this, despite the protests, this is the one of the headlines from the Times, the Los Angeles Times, in this case, about their execution. Remember, the Red Scare is starting, and there are other people revealed. For example, Alger Hiss. Who was Alger Hiss? You know, again, this was a cause célèbre of the left saying, oh, he was convicted of perjury on the basis of testimony by Whittaker Chambers, who was an ex-communist. Alger Hiss was a major figure in the American State Department, very important at the founding of the UN. Was he a spy? People think he did pass some information. He was convicted of perjury and spent some time in jail. There was never convicted of spying of any sort. But again, this is one of the names that was bandied about in the 1950s. And there are some very weird stories about Whittaker Chambers, who accused him of hiding material in a pumpkin patch. And it became sort of a joke on the left, how, you know, all this stuff was manufactured by the FBI. And it's likely that there was stuff manufactured by the FBI in addition to what they found. We then have, in 1949, the shock of the Soviet explosion of an atomic bomb. And we get people who made their reputation. Senator McCarthy, Roy Cohn, and our old buddy Richard Nixon was in the House of Representatives at the time. He also was involved in this bandwagon, turning over material to the House Un-American Activities Committee. And what is happening here is that McCarthy, who sees reds under every bush, that if you oppose the military, that makes you a spy. This is really what was happening here. And here you have McCarthy with a map trying to show where all these, quote, spies are, which he did not name. He did not have evidence, although it is possible, I realize in retrospect, that the FBI was feeding him slowly stuff from the Venona transcripts. Here's a picture of McCarthy and Roy Cohn. I don't know if you are familiar with the name Roy Cohn, but he really is a sinister character. He goes on to become a fixer in New York. And if any of you have seen the play or the movie Angels in America, you'll see Roy Cohn, played by Al Pacino, as quite a sinister figure. It's really, I would really recommend that movie if you're interested in Roy Cohn and the atmosphere that he helped engender. Well, one of the things that they focused on, oh, by the way, here's Richard Nixon from childhood to the Navy. One of the things that McCarthy and other people focused on is the development of what was called the super. The super is the H-bomb, hydrogen bomb, which is much more destructive than the atomic bombs that they used at the time. Edward Teller is a scientist who really worked at Los Alamos. He's a talented scientist, no question. He kept pushing for the hydrogen bomb, and Oppenheimer, as head of Los Alamos, wasn't interested. And this is taken later as example of his left-wing sympathies. He was really focused on the development of the atomic bomb, which was a tremendous technical achievement. We'll say a little bit more about Oppenheimer in a minute. But for the moment, you do have this conflict of what Oppenheimer told Teller, all right, you want to work on this thing? Go ahead, but I'm not going to help you. He, with the support of a talented mathematician named Adam Ulam, they did come up with showing that the hydrogen bomb is possible. Here's a cartoon history of Edward Teller from his 1908 birth. He's, you see, 1935 is a professor of physics. 1942, he goes to Los Alamos as the Manhattan Project. In 52, he's considered the father of the hydrogen bomb. And he becomes involved in this campaign against Robert Oppenheimer in 54. We'll see that in a minute. And he is ostracized by most scientists on the basis of his notion that if you are against the H-bomb, you are a security risk and not to be trusted in the United States. So here we have a combination of what is a spy and what is a security risk and what is opposing American policy. And in the eyes of McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee, these things become combined. Well, the H-bomb is exploded by the US in 1952, and then by the Soviet Union in 1955. So once again, there is this notion that the Russian scientists are incapable of doing anything, so they must have stolen the secrets. By the early 50s, there may have been some information, particularly from Klaus Fuchs, but it looks like the spies had mainly, in the atomic community, the spies had been ferreted out by 1950 or so. Britain is different, and we'll see that in a second. But I wanted to mention this. In the matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which was the name of a play in the 1960s, which became an international sensation. Here is a man who was considered one of the leading scientists of his time. Here, here are various images of him, the one on the cover of Time magazine. He is considered one of the most brilliant people to have emerged in the 20th century. He went to Germany in the 1920s as a graduate student and started publishing papers almost immediately in theoretical physics. He also was unusual in that he was very highly educated in a number of fields. He was quoting poetry all the time. You saw earlier his first reaction to the atomic bomb explosion was to quote from the Bhagavad Gita, the Indian epic. An incredible intellect. He came back from Germany in the early 1930s and got an appointment as a professor of physics at the University of California in Berkeley. Berkeley is now not only my alma mater, but a major university, American university now. It's Oppenheimer who put it on the map for physics. He created what was the major department of theoretical physics. He was his personality, despite the quirks in his personality, was able to attract many young physicists. He teamed up at Berkeley, developed with a man named Ernst Lawrence. Lawrence was a experimental physicist, and you get even now the University of California probably being involved in weapons research at one of its laboratories. So it was quite a powerful university in this regard in the 1930s, and then 1940s. When Oppenheimer went to Los Alamos, he was able to convince a number of his young students to come. Some of the problems that Oppenheimer ran into in his life, in his encounters with the US government, is in the 1930s, he probably was not a member of the Communist Party. He did, however, give money to every left-wing cause that came along. And remember, in the 1930s, there's no real progressive party in the United States outside the Communist Party. You know, they're in favor of racial integration. They're in favor of labor unions. They're in favor of all kinds of policies, some of which come about in the New Deal. But in the 30s, the Communist Party was very attractive to many intellectuals. Actually, that break with the party, the first big break comes in 1939 with the Hitler-Molotov Pact. But then in the 1940s, the Soviet Union becomes our ally in the Second World War, not becoming our, quote, enemy until after the Second World War. And for a number of people, it took a while to break with the Communist Party. Some people didn't break until the secret speech of Khrushchev in 1956. But, you know, for some of us, it's hard to understand this continued devotion, but it was there. And take, for example, Ted Hall, whom I mentioned earlier, never stopped thinking of the Soviet Union as a beacon of light in the world, despite the abuses. Oppenheimer, after the war, was appointed as head of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And although he was originally sponsored by someone named Oscar Strauss, Strauss becomes a major opponent of Oppenheimer. There are two major opponents. Strauss is one, J. Edgar Hoover is the other. He's absolutely fixated on Oppenheimer. Everything about Oppenheimer is wiretapped, is checked from the early 40s on, completely illegally in many ways. But as we've seen about Hoover, when he had an obsession, he followed it, as he did later on with Martin Luther King. But it was Oppenheimer at this time, which was a target of a lot of what he had his people doing. And in addition to these left-wing sympathies, I mean, for example, Oppenheimer at one point had an affair with a woman who was a member of the Communist Party. So all of these things are built up into a circumstantial case that said this man, Oppenheimer, who after the war was a major consultant in all kinds of US policies, was seen by some people, Strauss in particular, and in the biography that I mentioned, Strauss really plays a role here, as a security threat. And there's an infamous hearing in 1954 to remove his security clearance. Here's the guy who had been head of Los Alamos, who was head of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. He then becomes part of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. And the Atomic Energy Commission now says maybe it's a security threat. So I mentioned the relationships with Strauss and Hoover. Here you have Edward Teller, remember, father of the H-bomb. In a great number of cases, I have seen Dr. Oppenheimer acted in a way which for me was exceedingly hard to understand. I thoroughly disagreed with him in numerous issues, and his actions, frankly, appeared to me confused and complicated. By the way, I want to say this essentially means that Oppenheimer opposed Teller's ideas on the hydrogen bomb. I understand, to this extent, I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands which I understand better and therefore trust more. In this very sense, I would like to express a feeling that I would feel probably more secure in public if public matters would rest in other hands. What he's saying here is don't give this guy a security clearance, he's a danger. Now you have to remember that Oppenheimer is a consultant. And if you have a consultant, you don't have to listen to him. It's not as though he was making policy. And this security hearing is really a kind of a star chamber thing. Oppenheimer's lawyers were not allowed to see the evidence against him, and that evidence consists of piles of books that were put together by the FBI going back to the wiretaps from the 1940s. It was just agony for him. I would like to say that Oppenheimer also, although he had been a well-known theoretical physicist, once he went to Los Alamos, he was never an active publisher in physics. He was really someone who really understood. He was a great problem solver. People loved him at Los Alamos for this. He could cut through stuff that other people were doing. He had an incredible mind for that, and he turned out to be a very effective administrator, which is often not the case for theoreticians or professors for that matter. In his personal life, he had issues. He had a very difficult marriage. His wife was apparently a difficult person. He was a chain smoker. He had that affair I mentioned. What's interesting is he developed a very good relationship with General Leslie Groves. Groves was in charge of security at Los Alamos, and he was a fanatic. He did not want scientists to have any private lives at all. And if it were up to him, they never would have been able even to leave the compound to go shopping anywhere else. But they came to a modus vivendi, and in fact, Groves and Oppenheimer got along very well. Oppenheimer made some mistakes, actually. There were cases that involved, there were suspicions of a good friend of his, Haakon Chevalier, suspicions of his brother, Frank Oppenheimer. There was never any real evidence. There was one incident in 1942 which was held against him. I'm not going to go into the detail here. You can look that up. But he was a really important person that was drummed out of the atomic establishment by Strauss and by the military, because the military wanted more weapons, and he was against more weapons in this sense. Here's a later picture of Edward Teller, who was involved in pushing Reagan in the Star Wars initiative, if you remember that, from the 1980s. Let's switch over to Great Britain. In 1945, Fuchs leaves Los Alamos, goes to Britain. He becomes probably the head of what was called the Tube Alloys. What is Tube Alloys? That was the British atomic research. So here you have a man who is a Soviet spy, confesses to that later, was essentially in charge of the theoretical physics associated with Great Britain's atomic development. And the US had cut off Great Britain at that time. The US wanted to have a monopoly, so the British felt they had to develop their own. Fuchs confessed in 1949, spent 9 years in jail, got a little time off for good behavior. He went to East Germany and became a major figure in their physics program. And a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of East Germany. In his confession, he was supposed to tell you all about other people. And he, like some other people confessed, was very careful to reveal only the names of people who had already been exposed or who had died. He never did point the finger at active spies. Here you have this lady, Melinda Norwood, who was a secretary. She admitted what she had done. She said she'd do it again. I mean, she wasn't revealed till the 1990s. Oh, I'm getting, okay. Oh, my computer is doing funny stuff, but I'll be with you in a second. Ah. Sorry for the delay. So here's Melinda Norwood. John Cairncross was given immunity from prosecution. He was a private secretary in the two Balois things. He gave Moscow a list of American atomic scientists. He confessed in 1960, and the British kept this secret. They were embarrassed. I have to say that one of the British Secret Services, maybe they still are, but that time, the way you got in is because you went to the right university. It was an old boys network, and that continued all through the Second World War. Although they had some successes, they were really a screwed up operation. Here's an example. The Nazis were able to take over the British spy network in the Netherlands during the war. And what they had worked out is that what the British worked out when they send people over, when you send a message, you have a special code to put at the end of each message. So we'll know it's really from you. So at one point, one of the spies who had been captured by the Germans sends his message, and he doesn't put the code on. So the British, instead of realizing there's a problem, they write back and say, "Hey, you forgot to put your secret code in that message." I mean, the bumbling of the British Secret Services was incredible. We now have the most infamous case of the spies. They were the Cambridge 3, and then they became the Cambridge 4, the Cambridge 5, maybe others. The most infamous was Kim Philby. He's recruited as a spy in 1934, and he rises to be very high in the British service in the MI5. I always confuse MI5 and MI6. MI5 is counterintelligence. MI6 is intelligence. Those of you who have read John le Carré realize he's always talking about MI5 because he's looking for spies within the British system. Here he is. He defected finally in the 1960s. I'll read the Russian to you. It says, Kim Philby. And then up top it says a Soviet security officer. So he goes to Russia in the 1960s. It took a long time to reveal who he was. He had his defenders, all of his old buddies who refused to believe what went on, but he revealed a lot of things that were happening. At one time, there was an attempt to overturn the government of Albania, and here's Philby's comment. The agents we sent into Albania were armed men intent on murder, sabotage, and assassination. They knew the risks they were running. I was serving the interests of the Soviet Union, and those interests required that these men were defeated. To the extent that I helped defeat them, even if it caused their deaths, I have no regrets. He did a lot of other things that people regretted until there was a case in 1955 where he finally was asked to retire from the Secret Service, but there was no proof. He worked as a journalist and he still had his contacts in the Secret Service. He was living in Beirut in the early 60s when it finally became clear that the British wanted a confession, and he defected in the 1960s. He went to Soviet Union and probably drank himself to death. Cambridge 2, Guy Burgess. He had been recruited on the recommendation of Philby. He disappeared in 1951, he defected, and then he was seen in 1956 in Moscow. He remained unrepentant. He said he rejected the notion that that anything he did was treason. Donald MacLean was a buddy of Burgess. He and Burgess defected together. And for 4 years, he was the main source of information to the Soviets about US policy, not the atomic secrets, but their policy. Anthony Blunt, number 4, is considered an important art historian. And he passed on information on the ultra transcripts, that is what the British were finding out about the Germans. He was offered immunity from prosecution, and they kept it quiet. He was, his official title, something, Keeper of the Queen's Paintings, something like that. That, you know, he had access to the Queen of England all through the 1970s, until this was revealed publicly by Margaret Thatcher in 1979 that he had been a spy. So they were the Cambridge 4, as we talked about. Then all of a sudden, Cambridge 5, John Cairncross. We saw a picture of him in the previous slide. He was given immunity from prosecution if he confessed. And one historian has included that MacLean and Burgess drank themselves to death not Burgess, MacLean and Philby drank themselves to death. They lived in Moscow. They got some benefits, but mainly there was a lonely life for them. All right. Finally, as we come to the end here, there's this book by Peter Wright. Peter Wright had been a scientist who was recruited to MI5, counterintelligence. And it's, when you read that book, you find that all kinds of tricky stuff that he was involved in. And it's really, if you want the details of what someone does as a counter spy, planting microphones, hiding in attics, drilling holes in walls. It's not just that the Soviets have spies, the British have spies, they do both. He wrote this when he was, he eventually retired as assistant head of, assistant head of MI5, assistant director. He was very high up. He had been frustrated in a lot of his investigations. He was absolutely convinced, and he reveals this in his book, that Roger Hollis, who was the head of MI5, had been a Soviet spy. He makes these accusations in this book. I mean, he made it then to some people, but it's in the book when it comes out. The book came out in 1987. Of course, this was a bombshell. Hollis was dead at the time, but he said Hollis had been protected in part by Kim Philby, or he protected Kim Philby. He said he found no way of understanding the kinds of things that Hollis headed off unless he himself had been involved as a spy. There's no proof, but this is Wright's conclusion. So it's quite a book, technical, but the revelations are unusual. The British government tried to stop its publication, and they lost that suit in 1988, even though they had sued the Sunday Telegraph. In the USA, it became the #1 selling hardback in 1987. They sold 400,000 copies of this book. In the House of Lords, they said everything, you can't stop. The House of Lords was at that time the Supreme Court of England. You can't stop any damage, it's already been published. They say an injunction against the Sunday Times for serializing the American edition was dropped last week when a high court judge ruled that it made the law and asked to uphold the publication when the book was already available. So Peter Wright, by the way, he complains in the book that MI5 had never carried through its promise to give him a pension. When he retired, he was not in very good shape financially. This book made him a millionaire. He died in 1995. Well, finally, why do people become spies? You know, you have this, there's this Red Scare. Atmosphere of the 1930s, the Soviet Union sending its message to the world, and the US and Great Britain are suffering from the Great Depression. It's not, though, that the Soviets were not suffering. They didn't tell anybody about it. If you remember from the course I gave last year, the Holodomor, this great famine in Ukraine, was hushed up in part with the complicity of the New York Times reporters. I won a Pulitzer Prize for saying how wonderful things were. If you're interested in that particular thing, there's a movie, Mr. Jones, which is really very impressive. But at any rate, in the 30s, you have people who are ideologically committed. Were you in it for the money? I don't think so. Not at that time. Was there any truth in what McCarthy charged? Well, there were some spies, as we saw, but it created an atmosphere in a society where any kind of sympathy for what were considered liberal charges was considered communist. I mean, we have something of that is going on in our society right now. But here you have J. Edgar Hoover feeding this stuff. We also have the incapacity of the British intelligence services with those the Cambridge 3, the 4, the 5, however many they were. And well, that's what I have here. I didn't need much time, but I'm going to leave time for questions and comments. We have a few minutes, so.
Larry, it's Harry. There's a book by Ben McIntyre which talks about the Soviet. I mean, this works both ways, obviously, and this is about a man named Oleg Gordovsky who's, does the same thing, but working for the Soviets and telling England and America what's going on. I just finished it, and I will leave a copy in the library if people are interested.
Yeah, remember that people who testify against us are spies. People who work against the Soviets are heroes and defectors, right? In our image. And McIntyre has written several books about spies.
Yeah. He's a very good writer about this.
I'm sorry, someone else wanted to say something. You go ahead, Lynn.
I had Edward Keller for dumbbell physics at UC Berkeley.
Berkeley or UCLA?
Physics.
At Berkeley. And it was in 1959.
Uh-huh. Did he explode any bombs in class?
There were no bombs, but the class was televised, which was very modern.
Uh-huh. All right, well.
I got to see.
Larry, we've got a comment or question in classroom 2. It's Muriel.
Okay, we can hear you. Go ahead.
In sometime after J. Robert Oppenheimer fell out of favor due to terror, his security clearance was lifted, and he was giving a lecture at Swarthmore College. So Dick and I, living in an adjoining township, thought we would go over and support this man because he had done great work for us, our country, we felt. And I must say, he introduced himself and said, "Good evening, my name is J. Robert Oppenheimer." And it became a physics lecture. Dick and I, after the first 2 sentences, were totally at a loss as to what was being said. But we did feel that he had been treated badly by our country in his remaining days. And part of it was his wife. Was she not a member of the Communist Party back in the 30s?
It isn't clear whether Kitty Oppenheimer was a member of the party. She
Not him. No, it wasn't.
say though
I was thinking of his wife.
of
That's what we heard.
Yeah.
And again, many intellectuals grew up joining in the 30s, joining the Communist Party. It was, and of course, McCarthy, when he was destroyed by, in the hearings eventually, accused one of the young men who was on the, was working for the group that, accused him, and they used that to expose McCarthy, and that was the beginning of his downfall.
It's interesting that you felt it was a physics lecture. In some other situations, he's said to have been a spellbinding speaker, not only about physics, but about policy. He really was quite an individual, although a difficult person, but brilliant and a good speaker. And you have anybody else?
Yes.
Yes, Tony?
Dolores, why don't you go ahead?
You mentioned a movie earlier about Cohen that I'd be interested in seeing. I think it's
In America. The play was on Broadway, 6-hour play with Emma Thompson, Al Pacino, Meryl Streep, an incredible performance too.
What was the name again?
Angels in America.
Okay, thank you.
I think I lived among, in a family, my mother had 69 first cousins, so it was a big family just on one side. A lot of them were members, for a short time, members of the Communist Party. And I remember my father went to some communist cell meetings and decided that they were promoting the means ends justify the means, and he was out. But I have a particular cousin I'm very close to whose father was a member of the Communist Party, or at least was reported to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was a composer and composed a lot of film music and stuff. And for years, he had to have things submitted by other names and so on. So she's a well-known flutist named Paula Robeson, and she once said to somebody fairly recently, my dad was a communist. And the person, she thought by now, they would have that wouldn't have been a big deal. The person was absolutely horrified that she said that. But there were a number of them, in the New York metropolitan area, particularly among, I think, Jews, there were a lot of people who were sympathetic who'd seen the Depression and were sympathetic with the socialism that was going on in Russia, and felt that we ought to be doing a little more like that.